Hi, I'm Martin, this is Will. We're on the BASC Hampshire stalking scheme today. The main reason for our stalking schemes is to give members an opportunity to progress from their Deer Stalker Certificate Level 1, which is a very theoretical sort of classroom-based course, to the Level 2, which is a much more practical course where you've got to prove competence in a whole range of skills. What we'll be looking at today is the actual gralloching and extraction of a deer once it's been shot. So I'll take Will through that, show him my technique for gralloching. And the key thing with all of this is there's lots of different ways of gralloching the deer. The main thing is that the carcass is fit to enter into the food chain. So we've got a dead roe deer here. I just want to run through what you need to do for your level 2. You know, the easy bit is usually shooting it. It's the sort of the gralloching and processing the carcass which people tend to fall down on. Before you shot the deer, hopefully you've observed it and observed its behaving normally, or if there's anything wrong with it, you might have noticed that as you were watching it before you shot it. So that's an important part of the inspection as well. And then once you've found your dead deer, it is a matter of doing an external inspection. We've checked it's dead by testing its eye blink reflex, and then it's a question of running over the carcass, just having a look externally, make sure there's nothing untoward that you're worried about. At this point in the process, I wouldn't wear gloves. You can wear gloves, but I'm not going to contaminate that carcass with my hands. The main reason for wearing gloves at this stage is to protect yourself. So the important thing is if you are not going to wear gloves, then wash your hands after the process. Yeah. It's a good idea to start at the front end, at the head. Basically, you're just checking its tongue and lips and inside the mouth for any blisters or sores, which is a sign of foot and mouth disease. Check the eyes, the ears, and as you work down, checking in carcass, looking for sort of infestations of ticks and keds. There's no ticks or keds on here. Just check the backside. There's no oozing or anything weeping out of there. And then also, if you just check between the cleats, you're looking for blisters or sores. And you'd probably have noticed that if it was limping. All those look fine. Again, you can just run your hands, you're looking for any swellings. Again, if it'd been limping, you might notice any swelling or broken bones. Also, just run your hand down the back and it'll give you a fair indication of how much meat is on that animal. This is a young follower that's just been shot, and he's a good one to have taken out, really. The next thing we need to think about, we're happy that this is a healthy deer. We need to get it into the food chain as cleanly as possible now. So we need to think about how we're going to extract this deer and how we're going to process this deer. And basically we're going to do that in the field. Where it's shot here, we can't suspend it, so I would drag it without making any holes in it, without cutting it any further, drag it to a point, usually where I can get the vehicle. Yeah. So I can then suspend it in a tree, and then as soon as we've processed it, then it can go from being suspended into a clean carcass tray and away. Fortunately, we don't have a long way to drag this, but if you're going to drag it any distance, I'd recommend just a length of this paracord and some webbing. It just makes dragging so much easier. Through the mouth. Don't drag it over any mud or through a sheep field full of feces, but this sort of ground on the skin, it's fairly hygienic. The thing now is to just get everything ready. I've got everything that I need in this one bag. So when I go stalking, all I've got to do is grab the bag and I know it's all in there. And for a suspended gralloch, I'd definitely recommend getting a little winch system, because even for a roe deer or a muntjac, it just saves that lifting. I'll do a certain amount of cutting on the floor because it's easier, but you could equally as well do it suspended, but I just find it easier on the floor. Certainly there's lots of different ways of doing a gralloch. There's no right way or wrong way. The most important thing is it's hygienic. Yeah. That whatever you do, you're just thinking about where the hazards are, where you could contaminate that carcass, and you're sort of controlling those points in that process.
I think that's an advantage of the DSC too, as well as you're leading up to it. You can pick up tips and tricks from different people as you go out with them, whether they're guides or more experienced stalkers.
I've now got dirty hands because we've done the external inspection, we've dragged that deer a little bit, we've messed around. So it's a good idea to clean your hands. But the key thing, particularly when you're being assessed for your level 2, is just show the assessor that you're really conscious of food hygiene. a really good trick, which I only learnt the other day, and said there's lots of different ways of gralloching. You should never stop learning, but I had somebody out for their level 2 the other day, and he turned up with all his bits and pieces in one bag. And again, I'm going to put these rubber gloves on. There's no point putting rubber gloves on if you've had them in a dirty packet or a dirty bag.
Yeah.
They're no cleaner than my hands are.
A lot of this is about being organised, isn't it?
It is exactly that. Just thinking of the process and what you're going to do to make sure that everything is in place and ready to go. It's a good idea, if you're going to use gloves, to put 2 sets on, because at some point you're going to have a dirty pair of gloves, and rather than trying to put another pair of gloves on, it's just so easy to take the first pair off.
Do you always tend to use the sleeves as well?
Quite often I'll do it on the right hand, because that's the hand that's going to go into the cavity.
Yeah.
You shouldn't really get a lot of mess up your sleeves, but you don't know what contamination is on this jumper. I probably had the dog sat on it at some point. Just trying to limit any contamination of that carcass, because we're treating it as food from now on. In terms of how we're going to process this deer, I'd always do the cleanest cuts first. My preference for opening the deer up, and again people will do it from different directions, but when it's laid on the floor like this, is to go in at the sternum here, because that's bone there. You can put your knife in there and you're not going to do a lot of damage to the rumen. The alternative is to come just below the pizzle there. So there's the sternum. I'm coming well up the sternum and punching the knife in there, and then I'm sort of lifting the blade up, so it's the back of the blade is sort of parallel with the spine, so I can just sort of run into there, just beyond the sternum, and get my finger, and should be able to poke my finger through into the gut cavity. Once I'm through that place there, what I'm going to do is just put the knife in there and just ease it along to keep the back of the blade parallel with the spine.
That's keeping it well away from the rumen, isn't it?
Yeah, and you don't have to open him far, so just go as far as the pizzle there. So we've just made a tiny little hole.
So you prefer to avoid opening the deer up round the pizzle and back towards the haunches, because that's reducing the risk of contamination?
Definitely. Basically, the fewer cuts you make in this carcass, particularly at this stage out in the field, the less contamination you're going to have. This is some of the best meat on the haunches.
Yeah.
If you contaminate the haunches, you've wasted an awful lot of meat. So that's the gut opened up. In terms of his neck, just a question of going in through the thoracic sticking point. This will help the blood drain from the chest cavity. And then just opening the neck up all the way along the windpipe and exposing the windpipe. If you just grab hold of the windpipe, you'll naturally get the food pipe, the esophagus, sits behind it there. And it actually sits tight to the windpipe. So if you pull the windpipe up, you'll get the esophagus with it. Just going to come back up here a little bit, and I'm going to tie off around the esophagus, and I'll just cut it there. So just to hock the animal, basically through and up, and then same at that side, through and up, and then you've got that tendon which will hold it. And as far as this initial process, that's probably the dirtiest bit of the process, so I've now got a contaminated knife. The next stage is just to hang him up. We're going to suspend this, but you could do this on the floor, particularly if it was a much bigger animal, a fallow or a red. The key thing then is to think about where you're going to do it, because you want a clean site. It's just a question of it being hygienic. Put your knife somewhere secure, so you're not bending down for it. We are now going to put this knife inside this carcass, so I do want to make sure it is absolutely clean, having just hocked the animal with it. Some people will carry 2 knives. I carry a second one just in case, but my preference is to keep with the same knife, but just make sure it's clean all the time. So things go wrong, and it's a good idea to be able to gralloch in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
Practice different techniques. The next step is to get all the internal organs out, starting with the intestines and the rumen. You can just feed these out with your hands.
And you'd avoid opening the chest up here, Martin? You see that quite often. Would you prefer not to do that?
At this point, you could open the chest up. There's nothing wrong with it. Again, just keep the cuts to a minimum. As you open that chest up, you're going to be cutting hair. You should always cut from the inside out, so you cut less hair, but you will expose hair. You'll break bone, you'll saw bone, so there'll be bone fragments. So there is more contamination. So if you can, try and get it out all in one, just through this one hole.
I suppose in warm weather as well, it might be advantageous to open the chest up, let it cool a bit more?
But I personally don't think it makes a big difference, because as soon this wants to get into a chiller as quickly as possible, and then in a chiller it will cool quite nicely.
Okay.
The key thing is to get all these organs out, because they're retaining all the heat. And this, if you leave it in for too long, that's going to taint the meat as well.
Yeah.
Just feed all that out so it's hanging on the outside of the animal, and then you will find, look carefully, you'll find the pipe which leads up to its anus, so that it's poo pipe.
Yeah.
Reach up inside the cavity, follow that pipe up as far as you can into its pelvis, and then just feed that down.
Often you'll see people go to the back end next before they do this, but you prefer not to dirty your knife in that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, it's contamination.
Yeah, that's the main thing. That knife is nice and clean now. The next thing I want to do is use that inside the cavity. I don't, if I went anywhere around the backside, I would have a dirty knife. Try and do the cleanest bits first, and then move to the dirtiest bits. It's just a question of emptying that pipe as much as possible. These are solid faeces. I'm fairly happy that if I snap that pipe there, I'll have a length of clean pipe. There's no fecal contamination coming down that pipe. And the rest of the pipe, and it should just snap, the rest of the pipe just sits outside the cavity there.
If they weren't solid, would you use cable tie?
Yeah, cable tie, yeah. It's a question that then, once you can see inside there, you can see everything sort of coming forward. You've got the spleen on this side, the liver on that side, the kidneys at the back, and basically what we want to do is split through that diaphragm so we can get down to that pipe. When I first was taught to Gralloch, I would pull the food pipe through the diaphragm at this point and pull all that out. As we're pulling, we might as well just pull all the internal organs out in a oneer. Because it's hard, that food pipe might snap or what have you, and it actually sits tight to the windpipe, which is a lot tougher. So I can pull it all out in a oneer, and it should all come out quite nicely. To do that, you've just got to go and cut around the diaphragm, tight to the body, but try not to cut the liver or the kidneys, which means I can get my hand down into the cavity. I can now feel the ribbed windpipe. Make sure you've got a good hold of it. Just lay that on the floor. We've still got quite a nice clean chest cavity. Minor contamination you could wipe away.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't wash out a carcass, but with a little bit of blue roll, I'll just wipe that off, or you could trim it off. Washing just spreads it, it's disguising it basically, it's still there. So the next stage of the process is then to do the internal inspection, look at the organs, and it's always a good idea to start at the windpipe and work your way down through the organs.
Yep.
So as you work down the windpipe, you've got the lungs, nice and pink and soft. There's no sort of hard lumps or gritty lesions or anything like that in there, which might indicate TB. The other thing you get is lungworm, but they're fine. If you come down the windpipe, where the lungs separate off the windpipe, you will find lymph nodes, shot damage in there as well. So you are going to struggle to find the bronchial nodes and the mediastinal nodes with a chest shot animal. The key thing is that you look in the right place, so if there are swollen glands there, they'll be a bit more obvious. Yeah. And that you check all the other glands as well. So with a chest shot, you won't necessarily find those glands, but if you check all the gland sites in the head and the mesenteric, so those in the guts, then that'd be a fair indication of the health of the animal. And then check the heart as well. Just check the liver over. There's no sort of coloration or discoloration. There is a gland which sits under the back of the liver here. You shouldn't cut through the glands or incise them, but as long as you just sort of check where they sit and it's not enlarged, then there's nothing to worry about.
What would you be looking for in terms of liver fluke?
Liver fluke, you'd see that when you cut into the liver. You might see a little bit of discoloration, but when you cut into the liver and see these channels, the liver fluke live in there. It doesn't condemn the carcass, it just means you don't eat the liver. The other thing to check is the intestines. The way to do that is you've got one side where it looks like Cumberland sausages. So the other side, the flat side, if you just lay that on top of the rumen, then they sit here. That's that chain there, and that's a little bit swollen. And
if they are swollen, the glands here, would you incise them, or is that not?
No, you shouldn't incise them, especially if they're swollen, because that's where all the infection is. Yeah. It'll be sort of cheesy, chalky, pussy, horrible stuff. It could be fighting off any sort of infection. Doesn't mean it's a disease or it's condemned. There are a list of notifiable diseases, and if you suspect you've found one,
then ring the Rural Services helpline and the link is below.
That's the point I would normally take it to a larder. Get everything out in the field. Here we haven't got a larder, so basically we're going to do the whole field dressing and it'll go into it, then into a carcass tray and off to the game dealers. So the next stage is to remove its backside. Again, with it being suspended, it's a lot easier because you're not bending down, you're working at a nice, comfortable height. Again, this knife is clean. In the backside, you're not going to create an awful lot of contamination. If you're at all worried about it, just clean the knife again. So to do the backside, particularly on a roe deer, the easiest way is just to make a small incision just to one side of it. So pull on the tail, you can see the anus, put your knife to one side. There's nothing there you're really going to damage, you're just making a small incision with the knife, big enough to get your finger in. So then you can sort of, any feces that are in that tube, that's left in that tube, you push it out, and then you should be able to hook your fingers around that tube and pull it out this way. So there is a few bits of feces left in there, look, but we left a good length of tube there, so they haven't dropped in and contaminated the rest of the carcass.
And this is an area that many stalkers working their way up towards DSC2 might struggle with.
It's where you see all sorts of different
methods
techniques.
And,
So a lot of people, particularly with the bigger deer, you can cut all the way around the anus, tie it off and pull it back through. I'm not a great fan of pulling it back through because you pull in a dirty anus into the cavity. I think you're better off pulling it back this way. The only other thing left in there is the urethra and bladder. The urethra is tight against the pubic bone. So again, with your finger, you're just hooking around that pipe, and then you should be able to, once you've got it, remember you're pulling up that way, and the bladder should be still attached. Just gently easing all that out, and then again, you can just cut that urethra off there. I would leave that deer in that condition, and my game dealer will take it like that. He's happier to get it like that than have all that skin taken off and all those haunches exposed. The next bit is just to remove the head and feet. Not too much of an issue in terms of a contamination because you're just up against a bit of bone here. What you're looking for is that joint. See where it bends, and the key thing is to run your knife perpendicular to that joint and put some pressure on it to open it up so that that blade goes into the joint, and then just run your knife around and you should cut through those tendons. Same goes for the back legs, although with the back legs you have got a lovely little joint there where you can feel, if you run your thumb down the inside of the back leg, you'll feel the joint, it goes up, and just as it dimples in, that is where the knife goes. And then you just run your knife again perpendicular around, putting some pressure on, and it'll just open straight up.
And it's all about where you're putting that pressure, isn't it? It makes it very easy with the knife there.
It's about just getting the knife in exactly the right place. It needs to be perpendicular. If you put some pressure on, you open the joint up, and the knife just goes in there and severs the tendon. It seems, you wonder how the leg actually stays on. It comes off so easily. So with the head, basically to find the atlas joint, you go straight across the back of the ears. One clean cut across the back of the ears should get you down to the atlas joint. So you can open it up just by pushing your knife in. But then the key is to hold on one ear and let the weight of the deer open that atlas joint up. And then you use the point of your knife because those bones interlock. And then once you're through it, you do the same at the other side. And it comes off very easily. The final step is there are two sets of glands in the head that we need to check. And basically, there's the retropharyngeal, which retro means behind and pharyngeal is a windpipe. So sit directly behind the windpipe. So the easiest thing, first thing, is find the windpipe, which is there. And I'll put my finger in it. They will sit literally at the back of where that windpipe is. And they're sort of grey and feels different to flesh.
Yeah.
So there's one sits there, and the other one will be at the other side. So there's one there as well. Not very big in this one, so not swollen. He's quite healthy, he's all right, really. The other two sit under the jawbone, literally on that angle of the jawbone. So if you skin that jawbone back, peel the flesh away, you will find that's one there. Look, again, don't incise it, but just cut around it, and you'll see it exposed. And it literally sits on that jawbone.
And you're looking for that to be firm?
Yeah, it's that sort of grey-yellow colour. Basically not enlarged, not white and cheesy and just angry. when it's not bloody, then they stand out. There's a very different colour and texture to the rest of the flesh, basically.
And they're your submaxillary.
So that carcass will come back with the carcass tray. In terms of the Gralloch, because we've Grallocked it in the field, we can leave that in the field, which is one advantage of doing a field Gralloch. I wouldn't leave the head and the feet. I'll only leave soft tissue because that will disappear very quickly. Don't just leave it where it's obvious to the public or anywhere near a watercourse. It could contaminate a watercourse. So just discreetly lose that into the bushes, and I say the carrion eaters will get rid of it quite quickly. You could leave the head and feet, but I don't think it's a good idea. One reason is that they will last a lot longer. It's very easy for a dog to pick that head up and bring it back to its owner, or the fox to leave it on a footpath. Also, if I find any head and feet here, I know they don't belong to me. So somebody else has been killing deer on here, or there's a deer has died here for some other reason. So I will remove the head and feet and take it with the carcass, but that Gralloch I'll just leave here. So we take the head and feet away with us, we take the carcass away with us, we take the offal away with us. The other key thing is if you've tied off the esophagus, make sure you cut that plastic off there as well. And that's it, really. Are you happy with what you've seen today? Are you ready for your level 2, do you think?
I think it's been very useful. Obviously, there are lots of different ways to Gralloch a deer. It's been handy picking up tips and tricks from you. It's always a positive thing, spending time with a more experienced stalker. And yeah, I think I feel more confident now going into my level 2.
And I think an important thing is that you never stop learning. You know, I've never stopped learning, and every time I take somebody out for doing their level 2, there's always little things I think, oh, that's interesting, I'll do that next time. You know, there's lots of different ways of doing the Gralloch, and you need to be adaptable. So if it isn't a clean shot, then be adaptable so you can get as much of the mess out of the carcass and keep a nice clean carcass.
I think it's about bearing in mind the key points of hygiene, being organised and sort of thinking one step ahead.
Yeah, exactly that.